We've got our phenomenal leaders with us today. And today we're going to speak to them and get better understanding of freedoms and the state of freedoms in Africa today. I would like to start with Mr. Ladhu, who's just given us the beautiful address, just in less than 2 minutes, to tell us about the state of politics in Zambia today.
In Zambia?
Yes. In Tanzania, my apologies. I think I'm very much talking still with Mr. Hichilema today.
I think I was supposed to speak on behalf of Honorable Hichilema.
No problem.
Well,
but let's talk about Tanzania, Mr. Ladhu.
I think maybe you
meant
Zanzibar, because maybe it's closer to Zambia, where I come from. But well, the situation is really bad actually since the last elections, and maybe I should talk about Tanzania as a whole. But since President John Magufuli came to power in 2015, we've been seeing the shrinking of the political space in Tanzania. And since I've got only 2 minutes, I should just say maybe briefly that he started with banning of political rallies for the opposition parties and went on to ban live coverage of parliamentary proceedings of Tanzanian National Parliament, and then went after the users of social media. A number of young people have been detained and prosecuted for what they post on Facebook, WhatsApp groups, or on Twitter. Didn't end up there. He went on to undermine the newspapers. As I said, 4 newspapers have already been banned, and it seems like that's the path that we're going to take. And that is not enough. Just last 2 months, we witnessed in Tanzania something that has never been witnessed since independence in 1961 in Tanganyika and 1963 in Zanzibar, and since the Union. That a vocal member of opposition, who is the chief whip, Honorable Tundu Lissu, was gunned down just after speaking in parliament, as was being driven home. He was fired with 30 bullets, and he survived just miraculously, to an extent that his party, Chadema, whom we are in alliance, we'll see where I come from, had to get him to Nairobi because they didn't believe that in Tanzania would be safe. And I'm glad that actually the last about a week ago, he's been trying to recover well, and he's even giving a speech on his hospital bed to speak to Tanzanians. So the situation is very, very bad. But he didn't just end up there. He's also undermined business community, and even now, the international investors are not spared. So you can see actually that Tanzania has never witnessed a proper democratic system, but even the little gain that we made from 1992 have been lost. So right now, actually, there is really, really a gloomy picture. But let me end by saying that one good thing about it is by doing so, President Magufuli and his party has been alienating himself from the population. Even those who are celebrating the resource nationalism that he was trying to invoke have now come to a point to say actually that he's not really delivering anything for them, and therefore has brought all these forces that have been fighting together, and now there's a great move to try to get CCM out of power comes 2020 when the elections will be held. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hichilema, if I can ask the state of politics in Zambia, if you can give us an overview.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first, I'm very pleased to be here tonight. It's important that we exchange experiences, not just in our region, but across Africa, and I guess the world, as a consequence of the exchange of experiences, views. In our country, I think to summarize it really, we have had things going well. From the time that we moved away from the one-party state in 1991, we all believed that this is it, we've done it, we're back to multipartyism now. Went reasonably well, few difficulties here and there. Some would try to change the constitution to get to basically 3 terms beyond the 2-term limitations in 2001. I think the country fought that quite successfully. But since 2011 in our country, we have seen a degradation of the freedom credentials in our country. Very rapid deterioration of what we thought was natural, what we thought was basically a given, that we are free to move as we wish. Today in our country, you have a serious challenge with regards to fundamental human rights, liberties, and freedoms. Freedom of assembly. Very difficult for select members of our community to assemble as provided for in the Constitution and beyond the constitutional provisions as a birthright, as a fundamental universal birthright. Freedoms, movement, freedom of conscience, association. And recently we have seen a tinkering on the freedom of worship, depending on who is worshiping. And the examples are abound. For those in South Africa, I think you are familiar. We have a situation now in our country where, embarrassing situation, where my friend here on my right had to be deported at the airport. Very, very difficult situation for the citizens to accept that the country has degenerated so quickly within a short space of time. So to break it down, because we don't have time, we're losing at a very, very fast rate fundamental human rights, liberties, and freedoms in their entirety. And there's evidential information. We don't have to waste time on that subject. But coupled with this, we have a situation where there's a breakdown in the rule of law. And you know that the rule of law helps you, maintaining the rule of law, helps you to basically enjoy your freedoms. Because if you have no respect for the Constitution, in many cases, again, examples are there. We don't have to debate that. When you have disrespect for fundamental laws, including laws anchored on, if you like, the Bill of Rights, very, very important, Bill of Rights, then you have a serious situation in your country. We have a country where now the criminal justice system takes sections of our population, assumes that sections of our population are guilty until proven innocent. The opposite is supposed to be the correct, that you are innocent until proven guilty. And hence, the extrajudicial killings that have occurred in our country. Very, very sad. Hence, the detentions that we're experiencing in our country now. Since we moved away from a one-party state, we thought we had said goodbye to political prisoners. We are now back to a situation where we have a number of people in police cells, in filthy prisons, as political prisoners. Worse still, Zambia is used to hosting refugees from the north of our country, from this west, not much of the east, but listening to you, maybe the east will become an issue. But of course from the north, by and large. Today, we are exporting not just economic refugees, we're exporting political refugees. This is not something even I ever imagined would happen post-1991 when we returned to one-party state. So as a consequence of these issues, and there are many other issues that I don't really wish to waste time on, briefly, the country is degenerating. Its human rights credentials, its freedoms, basic fundamental freedoms, are being eroded on a daily basis. And I think it's very important that a forum like this understands what is going on in a country. Next door, I'm not talking of a country where you have to fly 6 hours. I'm talking of a country where you fly only 1 hour, 45 minutes. And a lot of South Africans don't know what's going on 1 hour, 45 minutes away from them on a flight, a cheap ticket, if that's all it takes. But in this age of information technology, how is it possible that citizens in the region are unaware of what's going on in a neighboring country? One of the reasons is that there's a gag on the media, very, very serious gag on the media. I think some of you are aware that we've had media houses shut down as a prelude to what is going on now. It started by shutting down independent media and the public media, public not in terms of a floated company, but in terms of state or taxpayer owned, where we in the opposition don't exist. If you watch television in Zambia, Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, there is no UPND, there is no HH, there is no anything. It's as though that we don't exist. Yet you saw the election results in August 2016. Somebody sitting in office above the threshold of 50% plus one is sitting in office on account of 13,022 votes. From a count of one, 13,022 votes. How is it possible that literally 50% of the population is not heard on public media? There's something wrong in the country next door. So I think these forums and others, such forums, are very important to highlight the freedom, human rights credentials, breakdown in the rule of law, now political prisoners and refugees. And the list is long, but all these things are interconnected. And I think it's important that we all understand that we are each other's keeper. That's the brief end point I want to give. We are each other's keeper. We were having a conversation with our colleagues from Liberal International and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, I think not long from this hour. And one of my comments was that there's this smear campaign going on promoting the color issue, race, and using race as an argument to disadvantage citizens who have happily lived together for many years, who have struggled for freedom together for many years. We should say no to that. And such things should not be allowed to happen in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what a sad state of affairs in Zambia. One wonders what happened there. But Mr. Maimane, listening to the two previous speakers, how different or similar would you say the situation is to South Africa?
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I think there's always an important question to ask, which is, can you have democracy without Democrats? Because I think it anchors whether or not South Africa has got enough Democrats to continue to fight for the purpose of democracy. Once the impression is created in any society that there's no value in the essence of democracy itself, then one of my fears about democracy in South Africa is that you can have the form of democracy, but really without its power. And it happens in nations like Russia, etc., where at the forefront of it, it looks like the country is holding elections, it's complying with whatever the framework looks like, but behind the scenes, none of those things have material effect. So I think South Africa, on one level, has had the fortune of on the back of a fairly strong liberal constitution, it's empowered citizens, profoundly so. It's empowered them to use their legal rights. And so now we're seeing a lot of court cases between the South African government and citizens themselves. And we celebrate every time we win that. I mean, it'd be unthinkable to think that political parties could take the president to court, the court could rule against the president and actually make a finding. I think that's significant in a democratic state. But it speaks a lot to the independence of the judiciary. We still have a luxury of a diversity of media. I use the term diversity as opposed to all of it being free because not all our media is free. And we still have the luxury to put our message on the table. We have, at least as things stand now, and I celebrate the fact that in 2016, South Africans went to the polls, expressed their democratic rights, and yes, through a process of tough transition, the opposition can governs in metro areas, and that's a significant development in democracy. So I guess the questions about what is the state of democracy in South Africa, it's always both good and bad. But I do think South Africa faces a crossroad as to where it will go. Whether it will join the ranks of other African states, or whether in fact it will continue to charter the vision that Nelson Mandela had, the idea that we should always stand up for human rights, we should continue leading a leading role in Africa. So if you were to say to me, what then presents the threats to our own democratic state? I think racial populism faces a threat for us, because the surest way to undermine elections is to make sure that people go express their vote on the basis of race rather than any ideas or ideals. That faces a threat. The collapse of institutional democracy, as we've seen and the worst institution to collapse, I think, is Parliament. Because Parliament itself has a job. It is the apex of accountability in South Africa. And once that gets captured, effectively the executive colonizes Parliament and runs its own program. And then ultimately, even the appointment of the judiciary and other arms of the state become compromised. So I think that poses a risk. But I also do think that if South Africa fails the test of providing leadership in the region, I think that in and of itself faces a threat. I think South Africa has failed the test of responsibility. We took quiet diplomacy on Zimbabwe. We've taken a much quieter stance on Zambia. And I do hold the simple principle: you do reap what you sow. And if we turn our eye away from atrocities that are taking place, we are now assisting dictators like Bashir come into the country and leave. That doesn't set us well from our values of human rights and our ability to defend when it matters most. And in 2019, it is going to have to matter most whether we can hold independent elections, whether in fact we won't just fall prey to all the trends in other African countries where we've defended dictators. So I do think we're at a crossroads, but I am, more than my brothers who are here, am much more optimistic about Africa today. I really do think the future of the continent is ours to win. I think that the next decade is Africa's, and I think we've got a profound role to play in the world. And therefore, I really do think we have to make some tough choices. There's no debate about that. But as others would argue, when things fall apart, they do fall into place. So I think we have a profound opportunity now. Right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Maimane. You mentioned Nelson Mandela. I want to acknowledge that today is the birthday of O.R. Tambo, one of our freedom fighters, who it is today that we enjoy some freedoms. And talking about that, I want to take you to an incident that happened in the Tshwane municipality yesterday, where white children experienced racism. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Maimane, on this particular question, and then I'll ask different questions to the other panelists. How do you see racism and race relations in South Africa?
I mean, it's an involved question, and I want to try and stick to 2 minutes because I can appreciate. The first is that obviously South Africa has a history of racial inequality. That is not only a social question, it's also an economic question. We've got to deal with the systemic processes of racism. And to me, I think that the error we've made in South Africa is the proposition that our miracle in 1994 was a victory of one race over another. If you depart from that point of view, then of course, naturally, you must say South Africa has Dutch colonialism in it. That was succeeded by British colonialism in a very simplistic manner. Then you have Afrikaner nationalism. Now you have African nationalism. The question on the table is what form of nationalism will take over from there. In that paradigm, you must then safe to assume that it must be the turn of another race to enjoy the benefits of the state. it's a function of replacing one racial elite for another. And once you get into that philosophical paradigm, trust me, you undermine democracy and you'll never deal with the issue of racism because you need it. You need that paradigm to support racism. You need racial discrimination to support that worldview. We have to break that. We have to remind the people of South Africa that the battle for a non-racial society is not a contestation of one race over another. It is a function of all races united to deal with the injustice of a race that was left behind. And it requires black, white, Indian, and colored to deal with that issue. I am not in the school of thought that says society must be colorblind. I'm of the school of thought that says, I recognize that we are of different colors, but together we make a beautiful rainbow nation that deals with the injustices of our society. That's the first. And the second is the incident that took place it was totally unacceptable because it spoke to the fact that now you deny people's rights to be who they want to be. And so what took place the other day then simply sought to say to people, look, we reintroduced racism to our children. And I think that's an injustice because racism does not come natural to human beings, as Nelson Mandela said. We ought to teach them that. And I fear yesterday we taught young South Africans another form. So where I stand, that's why in the DA you can have all races together. You can have all religions together. Because what should unite us is our values. And that ultimately we must recognize that we are in a fight against the system that oppresses others. And all of us can contribute to fighting against that system. So that ultimately those who stand, because I agree, racism doesn't just leave itself in economic terms. Football players who earn the same amount of different races can hate each other on the color of their skins. Then we can isolate those incidents and begin to deal with those and say we condemn racism because it is unnatural to human beings. It ought to be taught to human beings. And so I hold the absolute view, the role of the people who are here is absolutely vital. As liberals, it ought to be the fight we are at the forefront of, for we recognize the value of humanity and we identify the rights of individuals. We ought to be at the forefront of that fight. And I'm afraid if I was to say something here in this room, it's something we've shied away from to our own detriment. It's time we pull up our socks and begin to speak up a lot more on this issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hichilema, I want to come to you. I actually want to pose two questions to you.
No problem.
Based on the unfortunate or painful experience of you being detained in Zambia, how do you see liberals being denied freedoms? And then how would you see the international community playing a role to advance freedoms in your country?
Yeah, I think my prison experience really ought to be taken from two angles. It's a negative development because my rights were trampled upon. The important thing also is to know that it's not just the rights of Hakainde. I'm out today, but as I said, there are lots of other citizens, some of them as young as 19 years old, who will be sleeping in their house, and the police, make note of this, the police, taxpayer-paid police, together with political party cadres from the ruling party, jointly would hunt down citizens in their homes on account that they are members of the opposition, not just an opposition, UPND. You need to understand the politics in our country. We have more than 60 parties, but the competition is only between two parties. I think it's important. 2015 elections, by-election, colleagues in office and ourselves shared 95% of the vote. 2016 in an ordinary election, we shared 98+% out of 60+ political parties. So you need to understand sometimes there's this misconception that why is it UPND members being arrested. It's because the competition is between UPN and those in office. So the point I'm making here is that there is a negative side of the coin that citizens have their rights taken away from them through trumped up charges, brutal arrests, very brutal. I'm not supposed to be alive. I'm supposed to be longer. But time was not yet there. The point is that it is wrong from that side of the coin. But the positive side, for many people may not understand, of our experience, those of us who have been arrested brutally, tortured, detained, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 127 days, you learn that nobody, it's a positive side, nobody is actually free of such a situation. It can happen to anybody. Number two, you don't have to commit a crime to be in prison. Then you learn that there must be many other people who are in prison who have not committed a crime. Then you start treating prisoners differently because you have experienced it yourself. You also learn, number three, that positive, I think, that you have prison conditions that are inhuman, completely inhuman. Congestion, disease factor, deaths. People die in those prisons. And people die who are innocent. Even those that are guilty should not die because they're human beings and there's a way that they must be treated even in prison. So those are positive things. And one of the things I tell my colleagues that we have a clear and uncontested actions that we will take when our time in office comes. And that will be soon. We have to deal with some of those issues because we've experienced it. So now, what can the international community do? By the way, your question was that liberals. It's not a liberal matter at that point. It's a human right matter. Detention, inhuman treatment, torture is not for the people in this room because we're liberals. No. It is for every human being, every citizen of the world. And mind you, we are all one family. We're interconnected. So every human being should, and no human being should go through what is happening in a number of our countries. That's a clarification I wanted to make. Now, the international community, liberals, as a natural, if you like, connection, ought to do more for each other. This man here, I think he tested what we go through. And he was supposed to attend my court session. And he ended up basically experiencing what he experienced. So we're thankful to him. We're thankful to the DA. We're thankful. I must say so, Mmusi. Last time I missed this opportunity. I'm thankful to Julius Malema. I'm sorry that this is a DA platform. But I say that it's no longer at that point just liberals. It's no longer just DA, UPND. It is a humanity issue. Because these young brothers of mine, him taking the lead and Julius following, and many other people, I must say, in the ANC. And that's the point I'm making. That it's not a partisan matter at that point. It is beyond that. Who came to our aid in many ways? Ordinary citizens, away from liberals, came to our aid. To the aid of many who are still languishing in prison today, to get them out. So the point I'm making is that we are each other's keeper. I said it earlier. I think we have no choice. We've got to do more. We've got to understand that what is happening in Zimbabwe and the way South Africa, I like what Mmusi said, the way South Africa dealt with the Zimbabwe matter actually encouraged what is going on in Congo. Encouraged what is going on in Uganda. And surprise, maybe not surprise, encouraged what's going on in Zambia. So we can't say that what's going on in Zimbabwe and Zambia is a domestic matter. And he should look at me and say, why am I saying so? Because I was seated in Parliament when he invited me there. And the question was asked about, what are we doing as South Africa about Zambia? Degradation of human rights. You know, confrontate on affront on the rule of law. And the answer was, oh, that is a Zambia internal matter. I hope you remember.
That was there.
That is a Zambia internal matter. And later on, I was interviewed by a radio station, and I said, I think we must never have short memories. Zambia was the headquarters of the ANC anti-apartheid struggle. The man whose birthday we're celebrating today, O.R. Tambo, lived in Zambia for over 26 years, shared our little whatever facilities. I went to undergraduate school, university, with MK members who were masquerading, and don't misunderstand me, who were masquerading as citizens of Zambia, even adopting our names so they could qualify for taxpayer bursaries to sit with me in a lecture room in an econometrics class. So paid for by poor citizens. Today, some of them are ministers here. How can they forget that apartheid was not a domestic South Africa issue? It was a humanity issue. How is it that they can now afford to say the Zambia problems on freedoms, human rights are a Zambia issue? The Zanzibar problems are a Zanzibar issue. I think I've said enough. We are each other's keeper. We don't do anything about what's going on in Zanzibar. The implications of that, including migration and xenophobia in South Africa, is partially driven by the failure to deal with Zimbabwe properly by South Africa and all of us. And then it affects everything. And it becomes a racial issue in terms of black-white. What would you call it? Xenophobia, Zimbabweans against South Africans, South Africans, what do you call it? Is it a racial issue? It's a failure to deal with our collective problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You touched on a very important part about xenophobia, but I want to take it to another level and come to Mr. Ladhu. The issues of religion. Could you unpack your take on human rights, liberalism, and religion?
Well, I think it's very difficult, first of all, like to squeeze it in 2 minutes, but I'll try my best because the topic like requires on proper attention. I think as liberals, we all know that we believe in fundamental freedom, and that includes freedom of worship, which to me also means freedom not to worship if you don't want to. So I think that should be the fundamental. Now talking about the relationship, I think it's far bigger, and it's a subject that I've been speaking to not just in Zanzibar, Tanzania, but also outside. And whenever we receive guests from outside, we like to talk about our part of the world. And I'll talk specifically about the challenge that we face in our part of the world, Eastern Africa. Maybe it can also like apply to other parts of the world. I see that, and I'm a Muslim, and I see actually one of the root causes of like radicalization of our young people, and sometimes driving them towards terrorism and being used for that end, has been the injustices that they face in their country. I'm not saying that it is justified for them to do that, but actually injustices, poverty, politics of exclusion, lack of human rights and democracy, all these drive our people toward that. So I think it's so important for us liberals, and as Honorable Hichilema said, that maybe not just for liberals, but as humans actually, who believe in the cause of human rights and democracy, to emphasize on that, because I think when we, as to use this term, when we don't become the keepers for each other, then actually it leads to those who don't believe in democracy and human rights to continue to deny them, and this actually sometimes just leads people into like extremism. And as I said again, if you look at our part of the world, look, for example, the Zanzibar case. Actually. We are predominantly a Muslim society. It's 98% Muslim population. But it's a country or islands that have witnessed religious tolerance over its course of history. We have many political problems, but we have never experienced religious problems from time immemorial. Minorities, being Christians, Hindus, have always lived together with Muslims, and we celebrate Christmas, Easter holidays, and Diwali together with them as much as they celebrate Eid with us as well. But the past 20 years, because as we keep on saying, the only memory that the young peoples of Zanzibar have about democracy is stolen elections. From 1995, the only thing they remember is that they go to the polls believing that they can bring the change that can means maybe better lives, employment, more opportunities for them, but that opportunity is denied to them. So sometimes actually, when they see that actually this is also the result of for example, the mainland forces. We are united with Tanganyika in the United Republic of Tanzania. And we keep on saying now, the only relevance that the young people of Zanzibar see about this union is that every 5 years, it sends the army to Zanzibar to impose a puppet regime that will serve the interests of the mainland, not of Zanzibar. So sometimes the young people of Zanzibar mix that as well with also like the other factors, including religion. And that leads to kind of like hatred against people of other faiths. So I think it's important and maybe it cannot be overemphasized, that for democracy and freedom to succeed, that's the only way really to continue to keep the tolerance that we have known throughout the course of history. But the more actually we have got a shrinking political space that we keep on denying democratic and human rights, actually, I think we keep on driving people towards intolerance and extremism. And I think that's a great danger, not just actually for Zanzibar, Tanzania, East Africa, but also many parts where freedoms are denied to the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hichilema, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
The final question for the evening.
Thank you.
Could you tell us how you see the future of liberalism in Zambia?
I think it's bright. The future of our country, despite what we've shared tonight briefly, we strongly believe that Zambia, Zanzibar, strongly believe so. Whatever the challenges, South Africa, whatever the challenges, Congo, we have a bright future because it is in our remit, it is our responsibility to deal with the challenges that we face today. And in Zambia, we have undertaken on a dialogue process that will work towards returning our country into normalcy, to restore the human rights, to restore the rule of law, to solve the problem of political prisoners, detainees, refugees, and to deal with an ugly thing that in our country is not a racial issue, nor religious. It's actually the early beginnings of ethnic cleansing, very clear, where citizens from certain regions are being removed from the public service. It's going on. So, but we have to deal with these issues because we have one country, we are one. We will not allow such divisive elements, driven sometimes under the placard of politics, to divide the country and lose the opportunity to deliver economic and social advancement, to fight poverty. That's really, for some of us, what keeps us going. 127 days in jail is an issue, is not an issue, because we have a program, we have an agenda. So from that belief, we see that there's a future, and if we collaborate more, as we are doing today, using the liberal platform, which fundamentally, if we are sitting here, we are liberals. We believe in freedoms, isn't it? We believe in liberties. We believe in opportunities for everybody, economic, social opportunities, including education. And the debate we were having earlier with colleagues out there was that I think we should re-look at our definition of liberals and liberal democracy. We cannot avoid the social element because society will always have less than able people. That's how it is. And it's, I think a true liberal understands that they are disadvantaged members of society that need to be taken care of. That's how God created our societies and human beings. So I think the future is good. This sort of sharing of platform I see is very positive, and I think Liberal International being here, the regional Africa Liberal teams being here, it's a good platform for us to basically do better things, to be able to counter the negativities that we are seeing in our countries. That really should have no place in today's world, because we should be focusing on exploiting the resource endowments that our countries have in order to advance our people to better their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ladhu, if I can phrase the question differently for you, the future of democracy in Zanzibar, considering the repeated nullification of elections?
It's a tough question. But I think, first of all, I share that despite all that has been happening, I think one thing, for those who know me, you know, like I've always been an optimist. And that's why I've been like never giving up. It has been 5 times and we still continue to be there. And I think in each election we've been making progress. The fact that the last election, as I said, we managed to beat the ruling party and the Electoral Commission in a way by getting to collect the results from all the stations with evidence, with the results declaration forms. Actually, one thing that they resorted to nullification was because they didn't know what to do. We finished voting by late afternoon on the 25th of October 2015, and by 2 a.m. of the 26th, we had the results. Of course, now it's small, but it is not that easy, especially when you know that the ruling party is backed by the army, by the police, by the local government administrators, and every one of them. And yet, we could do that. And we know from an insider from CCM that up to that time, actually, they had their thing on the PowerPoint waiting for results, and they hardly 10% of the results collected. That also was true of the Electoral Commission. So I have faith in that, actually. I think that the issue, how we can finally get to the point that the results will be respected. And one other thing that we're exploring, that I think we in Zanzibar are suffering because we are treated in isolation by the mainland authority. Many of the people are of the view that, and I must maybe say one thing here, that Tanzania as a whole, we face the same problem that South Africa and other parts of Africa are facing, especially those that are still governed by the so-called liberation parties, that they think actually it is their right to continue to govern, whether they've got the consent or not of the people. So many people believe actually that it is only when they get removed out of power then there's a real chance of democracy. Of course, Zambia has shown the way that it can be, and then still you can go back actually to the old ways. And as Mmusi said, unless you really fight for these things and you don't take them for granted, there's always a danger of going back to where you were. So we've got the same. But now the focus really, after that success in Zanzibar, and even on the mainland, because the system, despite all what it did, it got its worst results in the history, even on the mainland. They got only 58% of the votes. In the past, they used to get 80, 70, 60. This time, they got 58. So as opposition, we are gaining. And I think the fact that we formed an alliance in the last election, it helped us a lot, especially with the split of the CCM itself. I see there will be still a further split for CCM, especially given the way Magufuli is running the country, because he's also not only undermining us, but also undermining the very people within his own party who believe differently in the way he believes the country should be governed. So I think with all this, I think when CCM will be challenged nationally, islands in the mainland, then there's a chance for Zanzibar as well to be like liberated. But I think altogether, if that does not happen, I think that one thing that will happen is that the drive for Zanzibaris to demand the independence from mainland will increase, because people now see that the only relevance of this union, as I said, is to send army and impose puppet regime. They see it as colonization of Zanzibar by Tanganyika. So if nothing will happen, actually, that is going to drive the young people. And this, the feeling is already there, that the only way to get this is to demand a referendum and to ask the people of Zanzibar whether they want to remain part of the union or not, which will be a retrogress. But actually, I think that can be the case. So I still believe that democracy is the future, because young people, and as I said in my speech, I believe that the young people are the future of this continent. And despite all what happened actually in Zanzibar, you'll be surprised that normally people say, like, what's the point of joining CUF, our party? Because it keeps on winning the election and never get the chance to govern. But yet, more and more young people keeps on leaving CCM and coming to CUF. So I believe actually the future is going to be bright. One day it's going to happen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maimane, to you, I have to ask, the future of democracy in South Africa with the looming ANC elections in December. As your closing remark, briefly, please, Mr. Maimane.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I don't think they're... Look, let me put the question to you in this way. There's a lot we can discuss. I can give you the permutations as to what happens in the ANC's conference or not. We have to come to this point and say it's immaterial who leads the ANC. Because just because you get a new leader does not mean you reform your identity. The ANC is a liberation movement who believes, as you were saying, it is their God-given right to govern forever. The issue for us is that we must sit back and say, as I said earlier on this morning, at first we must be liberated, and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators. We can't sit here today and have some form of reverence of the ANC. And that's a generational question. I know what it's like to have been in the ANC. But many of the time is that they have this hegemonic view as if politics can only be shaped by them. And therefore any permutation must be what is the ANC going to do, and therefore we must determine what happens in the rest of the world. What if we phrase the question differently? What kind of society are we going to have post the ANC? That for me is a much more energetic question, because it speaks to this principal truth. Opposition almost invariably never comes from the ruling party, because if it does, it follows what the Kenyans have learned. It is their turn to eat. So it ought to come from the opposition parties who stand for different values, who approach the matter by saying, when we win elections, the change isn't just from the colors of the ANC, black, green, and gold, to the colors of the DA. It ought to be philosophical, ideological, and say, we will govern differently. Half of the problem in many African states is that many of them, you can remove the ruling politicians, but the administration is littered with cadres that are from that same party. So invariably you see change politically, but you still are stuck with the same cadre of persons sitting in the administration. So when we change, we've got to see the change in every way fundamental. Because the lesson I've seen as well is that we've had other African states that have gone democratic change, but nothing really materially changes for the citizens, because those who come in just are replacing one form of racial elite for another. I think the future of South Africa, of Africa, and of democracy has everything to do with the fact that values that are in this room not only need to be fought for, as Coretta Scott King said, freedom is never won, it ought to be fought for in every generation. They ought to be fought for, but they also ought to be cultivated. The task that must be resolved from meetings such as this one is what is the vision for Africa and who are the Africans we must engage so that they share those values. Because we can't just take them for granted. Because they've seen models of big man politics, and who am I to assume that they are not ambitious to replicate them? We must fight for them. We must hold parties accountable so that ultimately the democratic project can be safeguarded. Otherwise, if we don't fight for it and assume that it's just going to happen by osmosis, we will run the risk that one day we'll wake up and say, yes, we did see change democratically, but still, in fact, the constituents and the processes have remained the same. So my optimism lies in the fact that we have a cause to fight for and a cause to defend. We mustn't sit back and assume that it's going to happen just on its own. We must go out, cultivate it, and make sure more people share our values. Because I've always maintained that the growth of opposition parties doesn't happen. People, when they go express their votes in the ballot box, sometimes go and express their identity. They don't always go out there to express the manifesto because not many people read that stuff. So what we have to do is ensure that the values of freedom, the rule of law, become things that are cultivated in our societies. Because if we fail that task, trust me, we'll see democratic change and no material change. It's just the basic thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of Conversations on the Couch, and I'm sure you'll agree they have been wonderful, informative conversations. A round of applause, please, for the three panelists.